Hello and welcome to a special episode of Perth City Talks. We're here at the Perth Convention Centre on a trial, not in the Supreme Court Gardens or in Supreme Court, but in here we got Jesus on trial.
In the People's Court of Western Australia, calling Civil Matter 1 of 2015, in the matter of an application for declaratory relief between City Bible Forum applicants and Australian Resurrection Skeptics intervener, court is in session.
It is an extraordinary thing to claim that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. We all know that humans, after their death, do not reappear alive and in a body that is no longer subject to the inexorable process of decay and death. Now, Christianity stands or falls on its claim that as a matter of actual history, at a specific time and place in history, Jesus of Nazareth experienced physical death, but was raised bodily on the third day after his death and with a transformed body no longer subject to death. If that bodily resurrection of Jesus did not occur, Christianity fails. And as Pope Benedict XVI accurately said in the second part of his reflections on Jesus of Nazareth, the Christian faith stands or falls with the truth of the testimony that Christ is risen from the dead. This dependence of the Christian faith on Jesus actually having been raised from the dead around AD 30 does not, of course, prove that this claim that he rose from the dead is true. So how does one investigate if that preposterous sounding claim is actually true or merely a misguided myth? Now, in these proceedings, your task will be, without fear or favour, affection or ill will, to do your best to assess the evidence about what actually occurred around AD 30 from the available evidence on its merits. Now, as the learned trial judge explained, the evidence will be submitted through the expert witnesses. Professor Judge will explain what historians can derive from dating the first references to the key Christian beliefs about the resurrection.
We, in the Australian Skeptics, urge people to be curious. We urge people to investigate what they are curious about. When they investigate something, we urge people not to rely on anecdotes or dogma. We urge them to investigate using sound techniques. We urge them to be honest in considering the results and to accept the consequences of their investigations in a positive spirit and with good grace. He should not appeal to your faith if you have faith. He should not appeal to any mystical experience that you may have had in your life. Mr. Davidson asserts that something happened as a matter of historical reality, something that he says never happened before nor since. He says that events happened which involved well-established laws of nature being turned off. The idea is that a dead human came back to life, not as some sort of a ghost, but in material form. An important part of our case, ladies and gentlemen, is that assuming the events actually happened, assuming that the texts, the ancient texts that my friend will refer to, assuming that what they say did happen, so putting aside authenticity problems and veracity problems, on the assumption that they did happen, the resurrection is not the only explanation for what we read there. We, ladies and gentlemen, have alternative explanations to offer you. Our alternatives do not require the laws of nature to be turned off temporarily. My learned friend will ask you to reject all of our natural alternatives in favour of his supernatural conclusion. You may think that the alternatives we refer to are strange and unlikely. And I'm inclined to agree. However, none of them are as unlikely as the idea that my learned friend will ask you to accept. Now, the evidence relied on by the pro-resurrection case is not first-rate. Almost all of it is hearsay. In other words, the writer is repeating what some other person has told them. A further problem is that the writer is repeating something that he heard from somebody else a long time after the event that is referred to. So we've got two problems. We've got a directness problem and we've got a delay problem.
Professor, is it your serious contention that it is historically warranted to believe that Jesus really left his tomb bodily raised?
Yes, there are arguably historical warranting that makes that to a reasonable degree likely.
And what do you say those historical warrants are?
The extraordinarily unusual character of the witnesses, the fact that we have several much considered and discussed and researched versions of what happened in the 4 different Gospels, clearly based not upon immediate response, but upon critical discussion, disagreement, and so on, across at least a generation. A very significant lapse of time in terms of reaching a full and tested judgment on matters of what happened. And yet the actual details that the individual Gospels record are extraordinarily slight. The only things that happen to be focused on in each of the 4 Gospels are that the stone was removed from the tomb. That's one. That the people who verified this or reported it in each case are women, and that at some point, in various ways, people suddenly realized that they were encountering Jesus again in what appears to be a bodily form, or they sensed as that. Most critics of these matters, and I think, believe that it was all triggered off by the conviction that Jesus was alive again. That is, it was not the discovery of the stone rolled away which set in motion an interpretative sequence of events. It was that the mysterious encounters raised the question, well, what about the body? And then questions must have flashed around, well, didn't anyone check it, and where is the body? Now, if you were in that position, trying to rustle up the evidence in a short retrospect, and seeking incontrovertible evidence, they tell me that in Jewish practice, the evidence of women would be technically invalid anyway. If that's correct, as I believe it is, it is a fascinating testimony to the intention of the gospel writers only to bring forward things that were specifically verified even after the event, after much discussion and doubt, by the only people who could say it.
Tonight we've been talking about miracles and history. What do you say is the relationship between miracles and history?
Well, as I started saying, it's a very important, it's a central question here. His Honour pointed out that in a case like this, we're talking about the balance of probabilities, and he mentioned the scale. Well, that's exactly the right point here. Miracles are not a question of history. The historical evidence suggests all sorts of things that might or might not have happened. The evidence is actually very poor. But what's relevant to this is that the miracles, as I'll get to perhaps a bit later on, are defined by the famous philosopher David Hume as something which is a violation of the laws of nature. This is not a question of history. It doesn't matter what history tells you. If the claim is that something was a miracle, it means that it can't happen, according to our best understanding of science. So you can think of anything that is contrary to the laws of nature. You simply discount what history tells you if the claim is miraculous or paranormal. And so in this case, although the Christians rely, as we've seen, entirely, in fact, as the counsel opposing said, Christianity depends on the veracity of the history. It's got the weakest possible case when it's depending on a miracle that can't possibly have happened according to our best science.
Examination of the historical questions of what really occurred is essentially a waste of time, because you know, as an atheist who knows that miracles do not happen, that no evidence could establish that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead.
You phrased it very, what's the word, contentiously or provocatively. I don't know anything for certain. Science doesn't give you certain knowledge. That's the difference between science and religion. As I said, science only gives you more or less probable knowledge, more or less reason to believe certain things. The reason to rule out miracles is that there's all sorts of better explanations. And in fact, I might say quickly that the term miracle is only the kind of religious word for what in philosophy of science we call anomalies. And every laboratory in the world is full of things that we don't currently know how to explain, and we look for an explanation. You could equally go on every laboratory and say, don't do any more research, God did it. Well, we don't do that because we understand that things that are currently not explainable, if we do more research, we'll find an explanation. So it's not that I know that the miracle of Jesus didn't happen, it's that everything we know about the world and everything we know about science says it wasn't possible. And so history doesn't count. It's not that I should add quickly, I don't discount history. I have enormous respect for Professor Judge and for the discipline of history as history. And in fact, I'm very interested in the history of the Gospels and the history of Christianity. It's not science. It doesn't tell you what happened, except in the sense of what happened as a matter of history, as opposed to what might have transcended everything we know about science. If the Bible said that Jesus, rode a bicycle and flew to the moon, or one of the, apostles did something like that, you wouldn't believe it for a minute.
Now, you remember at the start, I explained to you the balance of probabilities test, which is the standard that you will apply. This is not a criminal case, and the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt does not apply. But Mr. Davidson, SC, for the applicant, seeks to persuade you, and he has very willingly tonight taken up the onus of persuasion in terms of seeking to satisfy you. So he's accepted the onus in order to ask you to make the declaration in the affirmative that he seeks. The counter position, put very eloquently by Mr. Hadley through Professor SLEZAK, has sought to take issue with many of those points. Let me explain to you what a declaration is. A declaration as a remedy is a passive remedy. It doesn't make an order on anybody. It doesn't decide anybody's guilt or innocence. It doesn't command anybody to do anything, and it doesn't award damages. It's an entirely passive creature. But it is a reflection of an intellectual process that you've been engaged upon tonight. Let me congratulate you for your outstanding attention and the respectful way that you have listened and assimilated the evidence. We now move to the final phase of the case, which is for you to retire and consider the evidence and consider your verdict. And I wish you well in your deliberations. This court is adjourned.